We are now at the Welcome Center for the Mill Springs battlefield over in Nancy, Kentucky. You can see here in front of me, we've got the Welcome Center. We've got the graveyard just over on the other side as well. And we're going to go in here to begin our tour of the Mill Springs battlefield and just see what we can learn about this. This is one of the early battles during the American Civil War. Happened in early 1862. So we're going to go in here and see what we can learn about it. So come with us. Okay, so we just got to see an introductory video here at the center, and it gave a lot of the background of the battle. We're now in the museum. We're going to check out some of the artifacts and things like that which are here, and there are a lot of interesting things so far, just as a quick glance. So we're going to go through and look at some of these in detail. Here's one of the caps worn by a Union soldier, as well as some other artifacts. You can see that it is quite well worn. We have an American flag here that was found in an area home, and just reading the plaque that they have with it, and dates from the Civil War era. This particular sword was one that was issued to musicians began issuing them during the 1840s, according to the plaque. And of course they have one here at Mill Springs on display, and just as part of the various artifacts that they have. There is a big display of both Union and Confederate battle flags hanging on the wall. It has a plaque here telling some of the history of each of those flags as far as the various regiments and things that they represented. And what you see here, it's just a very interesting collection. The Confederates actually had built cabins at Beech Grove in preparations for a long winter stay. And you can see a representation of one of those cabins here. You can see they were very crudely constructed during the period, but they used what they could. You can see the bedding and a lot of the items that soldiers would have had with them, just to basically dig in and try to survive for the winter. Again, this is something that you can see in some of the old photos and things like that of many battles. You know, they were trying to build some type of a shelter. Winters were much more harsh during battles and things like that. Trying to be able to survive became a very big game, you know, just with all of the lack of provisions. You know, these soldiers truly had a rough go during the winter months. You can see here a drawing of the encampment. You can also see a lot of the information here that where it talks about the encampment at Beech Grove, as well as, you know, some of the things why they wanted to try to defend that area due to its location. And, you know, it was fortified there, and when the battle happened, the Confederates actually tried to return. When they retreated, they returned to the fortifications of Beech Grove. This map was drawn by a Lieutenant Colonel Carter of the 20th Tennessee. It kind of shows the fortifications of Beech Grove. It's as well as some of the artifacts as well. They were recovered from the site. This Bible was actually found within the camp of General Zollicoffer, and it has a series of names in the inscription. You can see the plaque there where it lists those names as well as some information about it. You know, it's quite interesting to know that this was something that actually was there during the battle as it raged. This letter was written just a couple of days after the Battle of Mill Springs by a H.C. Michael, I believe, from the 35th Ohio, and it was donated to the association at Mill Springs as part of the collection. You can kind of see a photo here of the folks that donated this letter. I have not had a chance yet to read the plaque, but I assumed that it was something that was handed down from the family and found its way back here to become part of the collection. In a lot of the encampments, not all of the soldiers had the luxury of staying in cabins. Many of them would have to sleep in tents. You can see one of the makeshift tents that they have on display here. Basically a big tarp set up on poles, and they would gather inside and do the best they could to stay warm. Obviously in some of the winter months that would be extremely difficult to do. This jacket is representative of what was issued to soldiers in Kentucky. There are also a lot of artifacts that were recovered from the battle. These artifacts include U.S. Army uniform buttons, silver coins, the tip from a bayonet, and just quite a few other things that were recovered from where the Union Army was encamped. One of the most intense parts of the battle was the Battle of the Fence, I think, as it becoming known, where you literally had the only thing separating Confederate and Union soldiers was the fence. You know, there were reports that the soldiers were literally grabbing each other's muskets, each other's rifles, as part of the fight. And you know, it was a very, very intense part of the battle. They've got it well depicted here. They've also got an informational plaque, as you can see here, telling a little more about it. An example of the early form of communication between households in this area was the dinner bell. And this plaque talks about how that the households, that women would use the dinner bell to basically notify their neighbors of soldiers moving through the area. And you can see one of the dinner bells here, as well as a representation of the typical home, some of the things that would have been commonplace in homes in this area. If you ever get the chance to talk to Civil War reenactors, find the guy that is the doctor for the company. I have had the chance on several occasions to actually speak to an individual who is a reenactor that has an extremely extensive collection of Civil War medical equipment, as well as the knowledge that will absolutely blow your mind. Civil War medicine was something that was extremely crude, but necessary. You know, they used what they had. The training of a Civil War or a military doctor at that time was much less detailed than what you might think. Basically, it was a class of just like so many months. I think it was like 9 months. If any of you know for sure, leave that down in the comments below. And if you wanted to become a civilian doctor, you basically just took the same class again. They've got some artifacts here, some of the medicines, the type of medicines and things like that used during the period, as well as a representation of how they would basically operate. I mean, they would just use what they had to do surgeries to try to save some of the lives of wounded soldiers. This is a chunk of the tree that became known as the Zollicoffer tree, where one of the general basically died. They dragged his body once he was shot over, laid him underneath this tree, and that basically is where he died at. And we're going to see that area later on in the video. You can see here when the tree came down. This is a big part of, it was a white oak that stood for many decades on the Mill Springs battlefield. This is a very interesting gun. The one here in the middle that you can see that I'm pointing at now. This gun was found in 1995 on the battlefield, and you can see the condition that the gun was in and how that it survived for well over 100 years before being found and then becoming part of the collection here at the museum. You can see here the plaque that tells a little bit about it, and I think that is just very interesting as far as how that there's no telling what's underneath the ground still, just as the way that the archaeology, I know with a lot of the things that we see these days, there's just so much more that we don't see that is still obviously out there and buried. We see many of the mini balls as well as musket balls that were found on the battlefield. There's ramrods, buckles, various buckles, as well as other pieces left over from the battle, just all through here.
Really the ones that are to thank for this being preserved.
Right.
They came together in the 1990s, and it was based off of a report the National Park Service did, though, on the 25 most endangered battlefields. And Mill Springs made it on that report, and that's kind of what spurred this local group to come together and like, hey, we have something special, we've got to preserve this. And so they worked with the American Battlefield Trust. Mm-hmm. They also purchased it, and title by title, you know, they either approached farmers or just waited until land went up for sale. They kind of identified the boundary that they wanted, and then they've purchased this land. So it's getting donated over to the Park Service, title by title. Mm-hmm. So we don't have most of it yet, but it's coming.
Right.
That part's a little slow.
Yeah. Back behind me here is a cemetery where a significant number of Union soldiers were buried. One of the things different about the way the Union soldiers were done and the way that the Confederate soldiers were done, a lot of the Union soldiers were known. There are records, as well as we can see here, showing exactly who each of these soldiers are. And there's actually a plaque right here as well that does list a lot of the names of the Union soldiers. Now, as far as for the Confederates, there were a significant number of the Confederates that were just buried in a mass grave after the battle. A lot of the locals from the area came out and actually helped to bury the dead, and that's kind of one of the differences between how the dead for the Union were done compared to the Confederates. It's just again, just goes to show you some of the horrors of the war. But it is, you can see behind me, the cemetery located here just behind the Welcome Center. Now, what we're going to do now is actually go to some other parts of the battlefield.